Welcome everybody to week 5 of CMN102, Creativity and Communication. Today, as you can probably see, I'm not in the lecture theatre. I'm going to be presenting the lecture to you online through this video. Pause when you need, look at your slides when you need, look at the reading when you need, but come back to the lecture. Okay. So welcome and thanks for joining me. Today we're going to sort of develop and briefly recap what we looked at last week in terms of ideology, in terms of dominant ideology, power structures, etc. So briefly recap those notions or those key concepts and also develop those further by looking at something called hegemony and counter-hegemony. So I'll explain what those terms are, although through your reading, the set reading for this week, you've probably become familiar with them anyway. So today's lecture, we're going to do an ideology recap. We're going to look at dominant ideology in media texts, hegemony and counter-hegemony. So we're just going to briefly recap some of those key terms and ideas that we visited last week in terms of ideology, discourse and hegemony. And it's really all about power and power relations and the notion that some people have more power and therefore have more control over the media texts and the communication texts that you engage with. But also you then have power by knowing that. So you can deconstruct media texts in terms of identifying what the ideology or the dominant ideology within them is, in terms of identifying what discourse or discourses they are presenting and therefore propagating or continuing to make happen. So power is an interesting thing. We're going to be looking for power, but actually the more you look at power relations, the more powerful you become in your reading of those texts as well. So let's just briefly recap on some of those key definitions that I offered last week. The dominant social groups can use sign systems to give messages that support their values and their domination. So if you have control over the media text, you have control over the message that's communicated. And that's basically what I've just said there. A dominant group as we identified last week, is somebody who is in a position of power in terms of usually wealth, education, and access to controlling the media text communications. So Murdoch, for example, you would say has a lot of power because obviously he oversees this massive media empire and so can control what stories are presented through that media and what stories are not shared or aired or what viewpoints are not communicated. So power actually impacts how you engage in texts and what texts you engage in. Yeah. Ideology, discourse and hegemony are concepts that enable us to investigate the ways that texts affect society and individuals. So really what we engage with, what information, what discourses we engage in, which perspectives actually affect how we view the world, what we value, who we don't value. So they really do impact the way that we live and the way that we continue to communicate our ideas. They are also terms that help us discuss and understand how the media presents ideas and values, and analysing texts in relation to ideology, discourses and hegemony is largely about uncovering who has power within a society and how they are maintaining that power. So we'll continue with that today. And I know you can hear some conversations way off. That's fine, we're in the university, people are here and having conversations. And I dare say, engaging in discourses through the corridors. So ideology. Ideology is a set of opinions, beliefs, values, feelings. It offers a worldview, a perspective on how you encounter society or societies, what your perspectives are. It's like, I always think of it, it's a bit like these pair of glasses, if you like, that I'm wearing now. It's a lens through which you engage and encounter the world, and it filters the way that you encounter and engage with the world. So it's a world view. one of the critical theories that you're going to engage with in a couple of weeks is called feminism, and most of you have some basic understanding of what that is. Some of you might have a more sophisticated understanding. Through your readings over the next couple of weeks, you'll have a very clear set of definitions and understandings about that. But having a feminist lens, for example, permeates the way that I see all sorts of media texts as well as social interactions. So I remember, and it's going back many, many years ago, so I'm showing my age, about 20, maybe 25 years ago, I watched a film called Fatal Attraction. And I'll just tell you very, very briefly the narrative of Fatal Attraction. Of course, I'm going to tell you through a feminist lens because that's the ideology through which I received the film, and therefore I understand it. It's the story of a young man, relatively young man, maybe in his 30s, very handsome, very successful, archetypal kind of American successful businessman who's married to the most beautiful, physically beautiful and gentle seeming woman, and they have a young child, and they have a big beautiful home, and in their home they have a big garden, and at the end of their home they have a rabbit hutch, and and the first part of the movie really just establishes this very equilibrium, beautiful sort of environment where the man is successful, the woman is beautiful, they're doting, they're white, they're heterosexual, all of those kind of dominant ideologies of what it is to be successful in America are permeated in the movie. The man has an extramarital affair with a woman with whom he works, and the film really starts looking at that relationship, and then the relationship breaks down. The man decides that he no longer wants this extramarital relationship and tells the woman that he's having an affair with, that he doesn't want to continue the relationship. She becomes, from a feminist perspective here, quite angry, understandably angry at that, in that she had committed emotionally, sexually, physically, etc. to him, and he's up to him to decide which women he wants at what time, and he has the dominance and the power of both of those relationships. And I'm not in any way condoning her behaviour, but through the movie she becomes more and more kind of obsessive about this man, and I won't tell you the ending because it'll spoil it, so please watch it. It's a fascinating movie. Glenn Close is the main female protagonist in it, and she does something at the end. I kind of have to give it away because of the term that was created as a result of this movie. She kills the daughter's bunny rabbit. And she then became something known as a bunny boiler. So for the next kind of 10, 15 years in our general discussion, people would refer to women that they thought were either a bit mad, a bit psychotic, a bit obsessive, whatever, as bunny boilers. Nobody ever looks back at that movie and thinks, how dare that man decide who he wants to sleep with when, who he wants to call relationships on and off with and when. Instead, the whole discourse around that movie was how women are dangerous. Now, I'm telling you that perspective from a feminist lens, okay? Through the lens through which I experienced that movie. That's what an ideology is. It's a lens, and therefore you see and encounter all the media texts and all the interactions that you engage with on a daily basis through that ideological framework. Okay, so let's go back to the notes after that little story. So an ideology is a set of opinions, beliefs and feelings. It's a worldview. There are political ideologies, religious ideologies, class ideologies, national ideologies, cultural, you look through your notes, legal, epistemological, you name it. And you can belong to more than one ideological group, or you can hold more than one ideological lens. So, for example, you might be a Labour Party supporter. That might be your ideological political lens. You might also be a Buddhist. I don't know, that might be your religious lens. So I'm not saying that they compete. Often what we do is we find what is consistent between the two sets of ideologies, and we look at the world and understand the world through those, through the consistency, if you like, through those ideologies. So you can have more than one ideology. It's a framework or a lens through which you engage and encounter the world. The point of an ideology is to offer a model for social change or a justification for adhering to an existing set of ideas. So if, for example, you're a Liberal Party supporter, and Liberal with an uppercase L, you'd probably be looking at the current political landscape and finding that the policies and the practices of the government are perfectly legitimate and rational and good. So in other words, you can use a lens to justify or affirm current practices and cultural practices or political practices. But also an ideology might be counter to an existing cultural practice or set of government practices and policies as well. So some ideologies affirm cultural practices and some are in opposition to. We'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of hegemony and counter-hegemony in a moment. So it's been known that, or it's been decided or thought that ideologies are hiding in plain sight, and that's because an ideology has a certain collection of values and principles that are to the holder of the ideology so normal, so naturalised, so obvious, so this is how it is, that you don't actually identify it as an ideology. You just think that is the way that you perceive the world. So it's really interesting when you start looking at ideologies, because you have to interrogate your own. You have to think, well, what are my beliefs? What are my values? What ideological framework, therefore, am I using in the way that I encounter the world, in the way that I understand politics or cultures or music or whatever it is? So we all have one. And the notion of it hiding in plain sight is this idea that we're not always conscious of what our ideological framework is or our ideologies are. They're so naturalised, they seem so obvious to us, they seem like common sense. We usually don't recognise them as constructions. And what do I mean by constructions? They are made, we construct them. We often construct them at a relatively early age. So I was born and brought up into a working class family where we had this sort of maxim, if you like, or this saying, and my mum would tell us very, very regularly that there is no one better than you, but there is no one lesser than you. So this ideology of equality, if you like, was inbred into us from a very, very young age. And I didn't call it an ideology at the time, but now I recognise that that is an ideology that we had that's so commonsensical to be, that I didn't see it as such, but it is an ideology. So let's think about the communist ideology. It's a social, political and economic ideology, and its central goal is to establish a communist society in which there are no social classes, there are no social class and monetary divisions between peoples. There is a common or social ownership of the means of production. There's no intention to break down the class system. Sorry, its intention is to break down the class system, to liberate the proletariat or the working class, the working people, and to redistribute wealth across all of those classes. And it obviously sounds great on paper. I have great sympathies and a great affiliation to the notions and the ideology of communism. Unfortunately, it's never really materialised in a true communist kind of practice, if you like. And then there are these other common dominant ideologies that you might be familiar with. There's capitalism. A central pursuit of one's life should be about the production and accumulation of capital. And capital should be privately and not state-owned. These are some of the basic precepts, the basic principles of capitalism. And then there's patriotism, this notion that, it is right and good to be proud of one's nation and proud of the people of a nation. That's an ideological framework as well. As is marriage and family. It's natural, it's normal to be in a heterosexual relationship, a monogamous relationship. It's natural and normal to have a family, and that family being a nuclear family. And obviously there are some people who don't conform to that or sit outside of that. And if you've got a very, very strong ideological structure around the family, then perhaps some people don't fit into that.